Hello again, everybody. Welcome to a lecture on plant diversity. This is the first part of two lectures will be given to you in regards to plants. This one is generally on the transitions from the alga into the non-vascular, non-seeded, as well as the vascular seedless plants. Next time we'll be talking about the seeded vascular, and those comprise primarily of your angiosperms and your gymnosperms. But for this one, this being again another lecture for our flipped classroom session, just giving you a nice introduction into the kingdom Plantae and its specific representatives, an absolutely amazing group, plants. It's interesting, obviously every semester we get into Bio 2, we talk about plants. My general experience has been, though, that people don't really want to talk about plants. They might like them, they think they're pretty, but for the most part, they're kind of boring. They just kind of sit there, you kind of stare at them, and that's kind of it. Of course, they're nice for food and some textiles and that kind of idea. But yeah, beyond that, let's get through plants and get to fungi. Fungi are a little more interesting. And then get through fungi because we really want to get to animals and ecology. People seem to really like that subject. And while I do as well, really shouldn't gloss over the plants. These are vastly important to us for several easy reasons. First off, bear in mind that just take food alone. Most of our foodstuffs we're dealing with are either directly from plants or indirectly. Now, directly obviously meaning that you're eating your fruits and vegetables, and you get like your legumes out of here, beans and nuts and things like this out of it. Very important for us. And as we well know, of course, today, diets that are heavy in fruits and vegetables tend to be healthier for us. People tend to live a little bit longer eating these kind of diets, including the fact that if you're a vegan, the literature indicates that along with everything else that goes with a healthier lifestyle, that you can live considerably longer, barring illness and injury, of course, by being on one of these kind of diets. So we see that's just a healthier diet to be on. Certainly we talk about being nicer to the environment, getting towards your ecology point of view. Well, we do know too that cultures that feed a little bit lower on the food chain, so you're down towards eating a lot of the primary producers as opposed to the primary consumers on up. It's easier to have that energy transfer from the lower trophic levels into humans directly. So you're eating a lot of fruits and vegetables and trying to go up on the trophic scale and eating higher up. It's just so inefficient, the energy transfer, that it takes so much more energy then to try to feed, say, the apex predator. And so you can easily see that. Think of like a typical savanna. What do you typically see more of? Well, you see much more plants out there, for example, than you do of the herbivores, the primary consumers. But then again, on the animal level, you see far more primary consumer than you do more towards the apex predators, like, say, a lion, for example. You don't see many of those. You just really can't support that. So it's just easier on the environment as well. So it's healthier, easier on the environment. Secondarily to that, but still very important, of course, just take medicines. We obviously have gotten a lot of medicines out of plants. Who knows what else we might find in the kingdom Plantae that will help us out in regards to medicines. The idea of losing like rainforest, for example, and its effect on say, not only biodiversity in general, but what kind of disease cures might be out there. We just don't know because we might lose them before we can formally study them. All the way down to, again, say, binding soils and sediments out. Remember, there are plants in the ocean, seagrass, certainly, and seagrass are intriguing. They're actually an angiosperm, a flowering plant. So while that's not topical for this evening, it's still very important to remember that the seagrass are out there, and like plants on land, that they bind sediments, that they bind the soils on land, obviously, so they're going to help sort of lower the incidence of erosion, bind out topsoils. When you lose plants, you might lose topsoils. Lose topsoils make it that much more difficult to grow crops, if not impossible. So you're kind of working on the desertification kind of idea, something we see in some countries like Africa, which is getting to be quite a concern. These are just very serious issues, all the way down to global warming, of course. Plants being a major scrub of CO2, that actually helps out a little bit. And it's very frightening to see not only a lack of interest in plants, but with that sometimes a non-interest in keeping plants around. So they say, oh, you lose this forest over here, you chop up that environment over there, lose more trees. That's okay, because there's still some trees over here and some trees over there. Well, first off, having these like islands everywhere of trees and things like that can be very difficult on animals. And when you, in other words, animals, the organisms, excuse me. But when you think of, say, animals in general, let's just focus there, and you're talking about something like a quick way to push towards extinction. Well, one way we see that is in chopping up of habitat, fragmenting the habitat. And certainly now you're creating these little chopped up areas by breaking up things like forests and areas like that. It's quite a concern. And actually there's some indication then that in the next couple of centuries, at the rates we're going, there's not going to be any forests at all. I mean, can you imagine that? How this planet's going to function without things like forests? Having these organisms out there to recycle nutrients. And bear in mind, especially when we get to ecology, that's very important, that nutrient cycle and energy flow as well. What if you're breaking down a major way that nutrient cycle? What are we going to do about that? And even down to the most extreme, which of course is extreme, could you imagine, say, having to go to a terrarium to see a tree, to see a plant? Can you imagine a world like that? It's so environmentally damaging, which of course comes right back to us, that this is only going to hurt us as well. So it's amazing just how important these are, from the foods we eat, to the medicines we eat, just to the planet functioning properly. It's just so amazing, these organisms. And they're not so static of organisms. You know, they do things, they compete. They may not be as like in your face as animals are perhaps, but they can compete. They compete for space and they compete for resources. In their way, they might compete for mates. You know, what pollen gets to where first, this kind of idea. Some plants, of course, a bit more direct, say like a Venus flytrap trapping something. That's pretty cool to watch. Or you might have like sundews and pitcher plants that can kind of break down organism types. It's really kind of intriguing just what's going on here. Competition's definitely out there, even in the kingdom Plantae. So this is absolutely an amazing group. Now with that, all these abilities we might talk about, it's taken a long time to get there. So obviously we have to worry about the evolution here as well. And with that, you can see this, you know, obviously, as we've talked about before, you start talking about formation of planets. So whatever source you read, you know, 4.5 to 4.6 billion years ago. And then with that, you have the cooling of the Earth enough, the surface of the Earth at least, that you have water forming on the surface about 3.8 billion years ago. And then slowly you're marching forward. And about 3.5 billion years ago, you could be seeing some rudimentary life cropping up. So we're moving into, you know, pretty much the track down the prokaryotes. And then a long time later, you're starting to see photosynthetic organisms. There you go, some cyanobacteria. Remember, we used to call cyanobacteria blue-green alga. We don't call them that anymore because they're not alga. It's an actual prokaryote. So they're called cyanobacteria, of course. And that is photosynthetic. So we've talked before about this oxygen revolution that began to crop up. So and that's a big change going on out there where you have a shift in the concentration of O2 in the atmosphere. And certainly it was not 21% like we see now. I mean, it's obviously varied throughout Earth's history. So with that, you start to see some changing going on. I mean, we're still talking a long time ago. But this number is the seminal number. We start talking about this 500 million year ago idea. And with that, a lot of the major organisms begin to show up on land. And with that, plants are no different. And since that time, plants have done pretty well. I mean, animals have done very well, mind you. Even if you just talk about the phylum Arthropoda, you know, they have some major groupings in there, the Chelicerata, of course, and the Crustacea and the Insecta, those kind of organism types can be found in there. And if you look at just the Insecta alone, conservative numbers run about 1 million species. And I've heard ranging all the way up to 10 million species in that group. Well, I mean, this is obviously nothing like 10 million or anything like that. So you might say, oh, well, animals, they've done fantastic. Yeah, okay, but still, this is nothing to scoff at. And bear in mind, they're vastly important plants are to this planet, not just to animals, but to the planet itself, as I was noting to earlier. And like I said, some are aquatic, of course. Seagrass is a wonderful group of plants, kind of close to my heart. So I did some seagrass work, quite a bit actually, when I was in graduate school. And here in Florida, of course, in places like us, seagrass are vastly important to us, being keystone species, very important for us out there. So we really need to have them out there. So it's not just land plants, they're aquatic, of course. Be careful, like I said, remember the alga is not included here. So green alga, brown alga, red alga, those aren't plants. And that kind of argument, as I noted before, has been going on for a while and is still going on. But there you go, still going on. But still, there's going to be similarities. As I mentioned in our last lecture, of course, the green alga giving rise to what we think the plants are today. So there's obviously similarities out there in regards to this group. There you go, of course, this oxygen issue and food. How vastly important. Even if you swear to me, oh, you know, I'm a carnivore, I eat meat. That's what I want. Every meal I have meat. Well, first off, watch your health. I just want to see everybody stay healthy. And so make sure you keep an eye on things. But second, with that, you know, this is still very important and we still must have it. But here in a lot of countries, in the United States notwithstanding, we have our vegetarians, of course, or people that are invested in eating a little more healthy. But I'll still see people that get these big old meals. So first off, size is an issue, of course. And then they have this large T-bone steak and this potato. And the potato, of course, would say, oh, you know, that's in the plant line. Okay, yeah, it's a potato. But then it's just chock full of sour cream and chives, maybe like a pound of cheese on it. I mean, got to be careful there. And maybe they even peel the potato, so they lost some nutrients that way. It's just not so good. And then you look on the side of the plate, and there's like a piece of broccoli. Okay, I mean, you just got to kind of think about that for a second. It is still very important to make sure you're having not just a good diet, but then having a lot of fruits and vegetables in the diet. And it's not just us, of course. A lot of land animals are here. that are very, very connected to the Plantae. So there's a lot of groupings in here, and we'll talk about some of the evolution as we go through this thing. But as I said to you, charophytes are a major connection to them. And obviously then, like I was saying earlier, the charophytes and the Plantae are going to share similarities to them. And you can see them here. Cellulose, so they have a complex that to create cellulose. I believe there's a picture of that in your textbook, or you can easily just go online and see an image like that. But there's a cellulose-producing complex. Peroxisome enzymes, so we've talked about peroxisomes, and obviously animals have those as well. Your flagellated sperm. That might seem kind of surprising. Oh, my sperm in plants? But yeah, they use that too. And in fact, with that, it's not too dissimilar. They can actually sperm move directly, like in water source, or it could be pollen grains. Pollen grains are pretty much a structure containing sperm in there, which is kind of an interesting thought, of course. I think of like Tampa in March. You know, some of those marches, you go outside and it's like a nice spring morning in your car, and pretty much the whole city of Tampa is dusted yellow. Okay, so you know, things like pollen is just going everywhere, and then you get that in your lungs. You're like coughing it up and just having quite an issue. Well, you know, bear in mind what that means. You're technically allergic to tree sperm. Your lungs aren't enjoying the fact that it has sperm in it. So, okay, it's just how it does what it does. It's a broadcast fertilizer and sperm everywhere, and then it gets to the right place and it pollinates. Well, that's pollen, but some of them don't use pollen. In that case, it might just be like a moss or a liverwort that might actually use just direct flagellated sperm. And then this unique one, a phragmoplast. It doesn't come up often, so I went ahead and defined it for you here, these cytoskeletal arrangements that they have. Notice it's connected to the Golgi system. I don't recall if this is in your textbook. If it isn't, I apologize, but you should be aware that it's there, and it's one of the connections between plants and the charophytes. Now, with the charophytes, they have this compound, the sporopollenin, excuse me. This is dealing with desiccation. Now bear in mind what we're talking about here. We're having an organism go from an aquatic system to begin to move on land. And not just plants, but of course Animalia and others had to deal with this too. One of the more difficult things to deal with in that regard is desiccation, drying out. That's a big change to your world. You were in this nice, happy, watery medium. It's really hard to dry out there, but not anymore. Now you're on land, of course. So you have these mechanisms that begin to evolve to allow organisms to find themselves farther and farther away from water. Some plants never really made it away from water. Granted, I mean, we have aquatic plants, yes, but when you're coming on land, they're still found fairly close to water. And these are going to be some of your smaller, like carpet-hugging plants. So you're talking about more like bryophytes and things like that there. So things like mosses and those kind of organisms. They have to be around water. They need to stay kind of moist. Their sperm aren't really encased in anything, so they actually use like raindrops, water, to move the sperm from one place to another. So this is a bit of an issue in that regard. So other plant types begin to develop strategies, in particular keeping their young embryos. In fact, these are called embryophytes. Keep their young protected, so seeds might begin to come up in that regard. There you go. The zygotes are encased, keep them from drying out. They might have bark systems. They might have waxy material being produced. So like leaves, for example, on some plants, you can actually run like your thumb across a leaf, and you see like that wax kind of build up on the thumb. Well, it's kind of natural that it's there. It's a waterproofing. Bear in mind, in a way, you're no different. We produce like oils on our skin, for example. Some people obviously produce more oils than others. They have like really oily skin, but we still do that. We protect our skin, keep it moist and supple, which is nice, but also help with a bit of the water loss issue. Granted, we're still going to lose water to our environment. You have sensible and insensible perspiration. Sensible perspiration you can see, insensible you can't see, and you're losing a lot of water per day. Even insensible, it's been noted you can lose like a half liter of water that way a day. So you're still leaking a lot of stuff, and of course we have to replenish that. Plants, in a way, no different. Bear in mind, a lot of plant cells, they like to be hypotonic to keep that tonicity going. So with them being hypotonic, you know, they need water, whether directly in it or it gets rain. And you can even see that during the day here in Tampa. You know, it gets pretty hot out there. So you might water your plants in the morning and you see, oh, they're nice and rigid and firm. And the cells like, in that case, to be hypotonic. They can get away with that because remember, the cells have that cell wall around it and the cell membrane's on the inside. So cell membrane would expand out towards that cell wall. Come back a couple hours later, maybe towards like noon, 1, 2 in the afternoon, whatever it is, and you see your poor plant's kind of wilted a bit, even though you watered it. Well, in that case, it's moved towards an isotonic solution, so it's kind of lost a little bit of that rigidity. If that continues, of course, the plant can actually have a situation where they go into hypertonic conditions, and the cell membrane might actually start to pull away from the cell wall and begin to get into a very dangerous spot, and plasmolysis can occur in that regard. So it's kind of dangerous. You have to deal with this drying out somehow, making sure they get water to themselves, keep the water if they can. They can have stomata to help regulate gas exchange, maybe some water loss. This whole works the plants are developed out. But that's just an issue of drying out. And again, in a way, we're no different within that. So there were benefits, though. I mean, this can be a definitive downside. You have to deal with it, if I could put it that way, deal with this significant problem, but there are benefits of coming on land. So you have to look with that, what organisms do, the cost-benefit ratio. And you can see some of that here. Obviously, bear in mind, in an aquatic medium, the further down you go, only the higher energetic part of the visible wavelength gets down there. So you can see that when you scuba dive, as you go down, you lose out the longer wavelength. Remember, longer wavelength is lower energy. So you start to lose out like your reds, for example, and then you move away towards like the greens, and then following down towards your blues. So you could be down, way down deep, deep for us, mind you, but down deep diving, and you might have had something nice, bright color up on the surface, but down deep, it's not very colorful if you can see it at all, and that's because you're losing these wavelengths. So light gets filtered out, and plants have to kind of deal with that. As you get down far enough, and you're in like the twilight zone, as you get down below like the epipelagic, and when you start having that, this filtering of light becomes a problem. But on land, wow, it's just sun galore. Obviously more in some places than others. So plants again had to develop strategies. While this might be a benefit, too much sun can hurt. So of course we have our shade tolerant plants and our shade intolerant plants. The shade intolerant, man, they just love sun. But if you got a shade tolerant plant and stick it in full sunlight, you can actually hurt it. It can burn the plant, lead to death on the plant. So you got to be kind of careful there. Obviously more CO2. Plants in aquatic mediums might have a little more difficulty extracting out compounds. And then of course nutrients and so forth. So interesting. And bear in mind with this one, there are things like bacteria and viruses in the ocean, not to say they directly go after things like seagrass, but they are there. So again, there's just ups and downs coming on land. So we're seeing that here with the plant. But again, it does have problems. Drying out is one, and here's scarcity of water, and that does definitely impact plant types. Okay, so obviously development is happening here, and it allowed for plants to begin to access. And of course, now you find plants in lots of places, even some obviously very dry places. So in the deserts, obviously we have plants. Bear in mind there, they've developed strategies to deal with this scarcity of water, and where you might have like a little bit of water at one time, a little flood comes by, and then a lot of times, long periods of no water. They've developed that kind of ability. And so much so that it's very adaptable, or adaptive. You have, for example, well, you can just ask yourself, well, how many leaves do you have like on a cactus? Usually when I ask that question, I get this answer of, oh, there's like none. And that's not true. The spines on a cactus are actually modified leaves. And then the photosynthetic area would be like the actual body of the plant itself. So again, things get modified to deal with this. Well, can we go on land? How far can we be from water? And what do we have to deal with? But as I said, we're debating this, whether or not the green alga and the plant should be collected together. Maybe I've seen some say that, well, we should take the green alga out of Protists. I mean, the kingdom Protists, like I showed you before, is no longer a kingdom. It's not monophyletic, so we have problems everywhere. Where do we stick it? Maybe we'll take green alga out of that, put them back in the Plantae. But no one's so sure yet what to do. So scientists have been arguing this for a while. But as I noted to you, we do call plants embryophytes. So with that, this is the general taxonomy we can use. Notice red alga kind of set off, but the green algas are the ones that are more directly related to plants. Chlorophytes and charophytes, obviously, these guys are a little bit more closely related. So it just depends on how much grouping you want. You can start with the ancestral alga, so way back to whatever that was. If you use this word, as you can see, Viridia Plantae means all the green algas pretty much, as well as the embryophytes, if you're talking about all of them. The most closely related to the plants are charophytes again, so you just use charophytes and Plantae. Those are Streptophyta. And of course, if it's just Plantae, we call them embryophytes. We denote that because they have embryos. They have, for the most part, very similar to what we typically refer to embryos as. It's very similar. Kind of bear that in mind when you're munching away on like your peanuts, what you're actually eating. But then again, plants are going to have their own unique traits. And here are some of those unique traits they have. First, this idea of alternation of generation. This is just the life cycle of the plant. But one of the most unique features of the life cycle of that plant is it has this alternating stages that have both being multicellular. So the haploid stage for them is multicellular, and the diploid stage is multicellular. Bear in mind for like Animalia, that's not the case. For us, for example, in our haploid stage, that is our gametic stage, and it's single-celled. So in that stage, we have our sperm, it's single-celled. In our diploid stage, obviously, we're multicellular, and the whole organism has a lot of cells to it. Not here. Multicellular in both spots, and dependent embryos. That's not surprising. Again, we have that. What's interesting, though, here is these guys actually use placental material. Now, it's not quite the same as what we say, but really, in a way it is, in that they have embryos dependent on the adult plant. They can use spores, and the spores are in this thing called a sporangia. We'll come back to that later. Gametogangia, these are structures that have the gametophyte generation. So with that, notice it's multicellular, we're talking about male and female parts. And then the growing regions. Apical meristem is where you find growth. So in the roots itself, in the leaves itself, that kind of idea. So here's that alternation of generation idea. Like I said, this is the life cycle of the plant, but within that, both the haploid stage and the diploid stage is indeed multicellular. Now, something a bit not like animals, if you will, is here. Notice that in the gametophyte stage, gametophyte is where you're going to get the archegonium and the antheridium, some unique terms. The archegonium is the structure that's going to produce out the female parts, that's the egg where it's produced, and the antheridium is the male parts, that's where the sperm is produced. But notice in that, your haploid cells come out of mitosis. Bear in mind, our haploid cells come out of meiosis. So it's a bit reversed here in the plants. And then this structure here, the gametes fuse together. When the gametes fuse, you're going to get the diploid structure. It's called a sporophyte. But again, kind of unique. Notice the spores are created by meiosis. So it's not quite like what animals are doing. Be very careful of that with your exam. And then, like I said, they have placental cells. Placental cells are helping to nurture, nutrients here, the embryo. So the embryos then are dependent on the parental stage, the parent himself. And then, of course, because of all this, they have embryos, and they have the dependent embryo. We call them embryophytes. So here's a general idea of the life cycling of a plant. Notice the meiotic cycle, again, is giving rise to spores. It is not giving rise to gametes like it would, say, in Animalia. The spores then give rise to the gametophyte generation. On the gametophyte generation, you're going to have the archegonium, again, female, or egg, and the antheridium, sperm, male. And then through mitosis, they give rise to the gametes. Again, unlike you and I, Animalia, where as long as it's sexually reproducing, you have the gametes being produced by meiosis. They come together, and so with fertilization, you get a zygote that is like you and I. We do the same thing through our syngamy process, fusion of the egg and sperm, which specifically when the head of the sperm gets pulled into the egg, it swells, ruptures, dumps the genetic cargo. The genetic cargo mixes together, and when that mixing happens, now you have the fertilized egg. We call that a zygote. So it's a very similar idea in that regard. And through mitosis, you get the sporophyte generation. You need to be careful through these life cycles. One thing you can ask in both the non-vascular, non-seeded, and the seedless vascular, which stage is dominant? Is the gametophyte stage dominant, therefore the sporophyte is dependent on the gametophyte? Or is the sporophyte stage dominant, and therefore the gametophyte is dependent on the sporophyte? You got to be careful of that, and we'll kind of see that as we go. And then they might create spores again, and you're back to where you're going. So again, it's a pretty typical life cycle for a plant. Bear in mind the coloration for the haploid and diploid, so you could follow here as well, haploid and diploid as well. All right, so here's just a quick snapshot showing you that the embryo is indeed multicellular. And then within this, very close to the embryo itself, of course, you have the nutrient material coming out of the placental cells. So again, it is indeed dependent, the embryo is dependent on the parent itself. All right, so as I noted to you, the gametangia, this is going to be having the male and female parts. As I said, the female part is called the archegonia. Archegonia is plural, archegonium is singular, and that produces out the eggs. And notice also fertilization takes place there. For the males, it is the antheridia, that is plural, antheridium is singular, and that is going to produce and release out the sperm, whether it's in a watered medium directly or not. Just a picture of one. It's not really important. You memorize this. Pictures and direct specimens, mind you, are more for lab. But you can see here, this is kind of this cupping, like flat area, shaped area is going to be the male part. So that's going to be the antheridium. And you can see there's multiple ones there, so that's why it's called antheridia. And then this one up here happens to be the female gametophyte, so it's going to be the archegonia. Again, being that plural, archegonium is singular. And one last one here, pretty much for you, the apical merystems. That's the growing region of a plant. So we're talking here about the roots and the stems, wherever things are formally growing out. So there you go. Here is some roots here, like allium root tip, that kind of idea if you're looking at that kind of plant. And then up here, shoot area. So that's where you're getting a lot of development in that area as well. All right, so I told you there are some derived traits here. Cuticles, waxy area on their epidermis. Same kind of here with us, like I mentioned earlier, having this oil that's produced on the skin, allowing our skin not only to maybe retain some of its suppleness, but also having some waterproofing abilities. Mycorrhizae are associations between plants and fungi. It's not noted here, but there are intracellular associations or there are extracellular associations. The intracellular one is called an arbuscular mycorrhizae, and the extracellular is going to be the ectomycorrhizal structures. Again, it's not necessarily here, but you should be aware that there are different ways you can do it, both intracellular and extracellular. And then secondary compounds, man, yeah. Remember plants, they have to respond to their environment as well. So they don't typically, if I may say, want to be eaten. So you have an organism come around and like mow the grass. So they can develop out compounds that could be either directly toxic to organisms. We know that for some plant types for us, it's toxic to eat. Or it might have compounds that are inconvenient to swallow. So maybe they have like silica that's embedded in the tissue, so it's kind of like eating glass. It's very fibrous and rough. You don't want to swallow that. It could really hurt your throat. That's kind of idea. And plants and animals learn to, this can be plants, have these adaptations. So animals kind of learn pretty quickly what to eat and not eat, either through experience directly, or if the species can do it, they learn from one generation to the next. Like humans might tell the next generation, hey, don't eat that, it's poisonous, that kind of idea. So it's a way to guard against, like fight against being attacked. For fossil evidence, look how far back it goes. Now again, that number shouldn't surprise you too much. That 500 million year idea does kind of crop up here. And you can see, look at this. Could you imagine fighting fossils like this? Fossilized spores? I mean, that's just incredible. Then we can take these spore types and say, well, okay, if this was 475 million years ago, well, how does that compare to spore types today? One, is the species really the same species? Maybe the species went extinct a long time ago. If it did, what might be related to it today? If it isn't extinct, well, then maybe you can directly compare and kind of get this idea of how things have changed over time. But it's pretty amazing, not only do we have fossils out there, but that somebody found these suckers. I mean, it's pretty cool that we can actually have those. So while this is not clearly understood yet, we're still, again, trying to work out the taxonomy of plants. Notice it still goes back to the green alga. With that, your book gives you some nice timings here. You can see that 475 million years ago is a branch point at once. That's your node speciation event. And liverworts are one of the oldest ones to come out that. And then from that, you can see your mosses and hornworts. So we're talking about your non-vascular, non-seeded in this group. Come down here, you can see the time in there, about 425 million years ago. With that, and be careful here, lycophytes. Notice they include club mosses, spike mosses, and quillworts. We call these mosses, but they're not the same thing as this mosses. These are the non-vascular, non-seeded, but not down here. Now you're down into the vascular plants. So be careful to separate out your moss types. On my exams, or even in general, if I just use the word moss, I'm referring up here. If I'm not, then I have to be specific as to what moss type I'm talking about so that you have an idea if I'm referring down here to the vasculars. Then you have pterophytes, those are ferns, horsetails, whisk ferns, but a lot of ferns in there. And lastly, number 3, you can see about 300 million years ago, your gymnosperms and angiosperms. These are the seeded vascular plants. Typically what we call plants in general, although again, all these guys are plants too. But even here you have like trees, that's a very general term. This word plant alone is general. I mean, which one are we talking about? Any of these guys are plants. So you gotta be specific. In here, if you say tree, well, which tree are you talking about? Trees can have flowers on it. A cherry tree can, an orange tree, that kind of idea. They have blossoms that grow in there. So in that case, those are actually angiosperms. Here you're talking about things like pine trees and bristlecone pine. You can have the Cycadophyta and Ginkgophyta and Gnatophytas in there. So it just depends on which one you're talking about. Be specific again. And then the datings can obviously vary depending on your specificity. So vascular tissue comes up here. I was saying a lot, they're like the beginning ones. The ones tonight we're really talking about, the non-vascular, non-seeded. So this vascular idea is important. We obviously have vascular tissue, arteries and veins. Now, not quite the same here, where they don't have like a pumping mechanism like a pumping heart. I mean, you could talk about like heartwood and stuff, but they don't really have like a pumping heart, of course. But the analogy of like arteries and veins is not lost here. And these guys is called the xylem and the phloem, if they have it. Remember, we have the non-vascular, non-seeded. We have the seedless vascular, and then the seeded vascular. So if you say, okay, it's non-vascular, they have no xylem and phloem. They have no way to move around water and minerals. That would be from the xylem system. And then no way to move around like sugars. That would be from phloem system. So again, xylem is going to be for water and minerals kind of coming up from the roots and up towards the tree, kind of moving up the tree. And then the phloem is taking those sugar compounds, things like that, and distributing it out to the rest of the tree. So that kind of idea. They don't have that. So they tend to be kind of stunted in sight. As you get towards the vascular ones, so again, that's vascular seedless and vascular seeded, they can grow much bigger, especially like today's gymnosperms and angiosperms, your vascular seed plants. Man, those things can be tall. Just go look at something like Sequoia dendron and tell me how big a sequoia tree can be. I mean, these things are quite large that are out there. So this vascular tissue ends up being quite important. If they don't have vascular tissue and are seedless, we generally call them bryophytes. Now be careful there. There's bryophyte and bryophytes. I know that doesn't seem like much, but it's two different things. And I'll come back to that in a minute, what that's differentiating. Notice that all of them, and all of those, the mosses, the liverworts, those kind of guys, they're all bryophytes. Notice it's not monophyletic. So right there we have a problem. It's not a valid grouping because it doesn't have the monophyletic feature to it. So again, we got to be kind of careful here. For the seedless vascular, pterophytes and lycophytes, like I said, lycophytes, club mosses, and things like them. Pterophytes, ferns, they come to mind. And even here in Tampa, of course, we got ferns around. Certainly Florida is known for ferns. So they could be at least in the subtropics and quite a bit north up into the temperate zone. So again, they're quite a voluminous group in that regard. They do pretty well. But notice here, seedless vascular paraphyletic. So again, we have a bit of an issue there. And then finally, seeds. When you talk about that, you can have the naked seed plants. Those are the gymnosperms. Or you can have the ones that actually have flowers. Those are angiosperms. So again, it just depends on the grouping and whether or not it's a valid clade group or not. All right, so the first group here, bryophytes. Okay, now again, be kind of careful here. If you use the word bryophytes with an S, that means any one of these guys. Liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. However, when you start talking about the phyla that are here, notice that one of the phyla is Bryophyta. All right, so if you say phyta, Bryophyta, that means the phylum Bryophyta, that means just mosses. That does not include hornworts or liverworts. And once again, if you use bryophytes, that means all of them. It's very close, so do be careful here. So phylum Bryophyta are mosses. Here, phylum Anthocerophyta, that are hornworts. And then the phylum Hepatophyta, that's liverworts. All of those guys. So again, know them for your test again as bryophytes versus bryophyta. And then along the idea of bryophyta, the three main phyla that you see here. All right, for the gametophytes. Now here again is kind of where we get back to that what's dominant, what's not dominant. For gametophytes, the gametophyte generation is the dominant generation on the bryophytes. And the sporophyte generation is dependent on the gametophyte generation here. So even though the plant itself doesn't get very big, you still have to be careful which one is dominant, and here the gametophyte generation is indeed dominant. So there you go. You don't have the sporophytes being dominant, and they aren't there all the time. Now with this generations, you see this guy, the Protonema. This is like the beginning stage of the bryophyte itself. It's like, as noted there, the early stage. And it is where the haploid structurings are produced. Rhizoids, now be careful, rhizoids are not roots. These are just an anchoring system. These guys don't have roots. Remember, they don't have xylem and phloem, so xylem system is your rooting system that brings in water and minerals. These guys don't have that. But with the gametophyte, they do have the archegonium and the antheridium. And as I noted to you earlier, some plant types use water to move the sperm around. Here's where you see that. So when you look at the life cycle, you can see here the sporangium creates the spores. One spore will go and create the male parts, the male gametophyte, that's the antheridium. And then one will go form the female parts, the female gametophyte, that's the archegonium. So brain can pick it up and move the sperm over to the female part. It then will fertilize the egg. When it fertilizes the egg, now you have a zygote. The zygote, that will be the sporophyte that grows out of the gametophyte. So here's your growing sporophyte, and there you go. You have the sporophyte that grew out. You can see the anatomy of the sporophyte, the foot, the sporangium, and then the seta are all there. But the sporophyte is again dependent on the gametophyte generation in this regard. Now I get asked sometimes this question, and the answer is actually yes, in that it is possible for this plant type to self-fertilize. It's not optimal maybe, but it can indeed happen. So there's the anatomy again. As I said, the foot, the seta, which is also known as the stalking system, and the sporangium, also known as capsule, they are going to release the spores, and those spores come out of this structure called the peristome. This word stomata I used earlier tonight, and it's talking about opening structures. They can open and close and regulate. Here, notice they're regulating gases. As you get towards the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, you might have a leaf that has a stomata in it, and it is indeed gases and maybe a little bit of water that can be exchanged there as well. So there's a nice picture of it. You can see the gametophyte down here. This is the dominant generation. It's the one that kind of hangs around. And the sporophyte generation is growing out of that. Of course, the spores are going to be produced here, and they will like rip open and drop out the spores when they're told to do so. Okay, now with that, spores themselves kind of neat how they work, but when you talk about how the life cycling works here, you have to remember that the mosses, I know this is ferns, but the mosses have been around for quite some time. And it's not only a very long known species type out there, but there was a time when the moss pretty much was the forest. It was just like a carpet is pretty much what the forest was. So they've been around a long time. They haven't changed all that much. They've been very successful at what they do. Obviously, they're still here today doing quite well. And they can be very impacting on the environment. So there's quite a few things I would like to show you here. The first one I would like to show you is this amazing little video that was produced out where this gentleman actually took the time to make a tribute to moss. Now, they might seem like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? Somebody did a tribute to moss. But it just shows you how important these are to us. And it gives you kind of an idea of their life histories and some of their roles in the environment. So when you're kind of playing through this, he's actually showing you a lot of little things kind of going on. And this is one I wanted to show you. This animal coming through here, it might be hard for you to see it. This guy here is Archaeopteryx. And I would suggest for you to take a moment and go look at the unique history on Archaeopteryx. It's kind of an intriguing animal. Bear in mind, as I've told you before, the Dinosauria are still alive. Not all dinosaurs went extinct when you're talking about the KT boundary. And this is the one that's showing you some of the transition as you're going from what dinosaurs were into, in the theropod line at least, going into the birds. And this is kind of a transition where you see what is a dinosaur, but it has still some of the bird-like features as well. They're beginning to develop feathers out. Now, feathers initially, some speculate might be for camouflage, might be for thermal protection, that sort of issue, but also for gliding, like he's showing you here. Not for flight yet. Flight might come later, but gliding, like he's showing you here. But it's still distinctly dinosaurian. Bear in mind, birds are reptiles, so reptiles then, reptiles now. But the scaling on the legs, you can't see it here, but it has a beak that's toothed, this kind of idea. So we see some interesting connections there. And then over here near the end of the video, one point I would like for you to consider, and that's this. Bear in mind when he's showing you this, look what he's noting in a course, the Quaternary mass extinction. Bear in mind what we talked about in the geological record, that for the most part we're talking about the subdivisions being from mass extinctions. We've had a lot of little extinctional events go through, but then, depending on definition, 3 to 5 major mass extinctions. And I was talking about the fact of, well, what are we living in? Are we living in the Quaternary? Are we living in like the Pleistocene? Are we living in the Holocene? Where are we really? And some people still think we're actually living in the Pleistocene. And really the only demarcation going into what we are now is that humans are here. So where is that mass extinction? So it's kind of intriguing what this author is showing to you, that maybe it's happening as we're talking about. Now granted, you have to kind of infer what he means here. Not only the shape, but of course the evolution of the shape is very particular again. So I'll show you the whole shaping again on that thing. Go back a little bit here. Oops, I lost it again. I do apologize. So back to that Quaternary mass extinction again. There it is. All right, so it's coming up in a second here. So showing you the shaping that's going on with this bomb that's going off. That should obviously ring some bells here. So who knows? Is that fair to say that A, it's happening, and B, is that going to happen? We've not had a nuclear war, of course, and yeah, we've had 2 nuclear bombs dropped, as frightening as that might be, but it hasn't. And then this assumption, too, that mosses will persist. Think about that one. Do you think that's true? Do you think if there's a major mass extinction out there, humans are inducing that, and it might be something as catastrophic and horrible as a nuclear war, what's to say the mosses are going to live? So maybe they will, maybe they won't. I've never tested it. I don't want to test it. But it's something for you to ponder. Beyond that, a very intriguing video, to say the least. Now also with that, when you get a lot of moss in an area, again, they can really impact the area, not just recycling of nutrients and structuring environment, but also sort of some of the abiotic features in the environment as well. Now with that, one of the things we find, you get a lot of moss in kind of like a swampy area, you're creating these bogs, and these bogs have a very particular feature to them. If anything else, they're highly acidic, at least they can be. And that causes problems in maybe some of the decomposers doing their jobs. And we've actually had fossils, in this case mummies, come out of that. And here's probably one of the most famous mummies. This is one of the bog mummies that are out there. And with this gentleman, you can see, look how well preserved this gentleman is. Even though it's dated at 400, well, I think it's 4 BCE, but still it's quite a lot. No, it is 4000 BCE. Wow, it's way back when. But it's dated quite a long time ago. And this is not the oldest of the bog mummies out there. There you go. You can see he's quite old. So 2300, excuse me. Quite old. But look at how well preserved the gentleman is. And when you look a little closer, look at the fingers on the gentleman. I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. You can see retention of detail. Now with that, to show you a little bit more, a few things here. You can see very good facial feature on the gentleman. You can see the clothes he was wearing. I mean, the skull cap that he's wearing there, and that's actually the hat that he's wearing, is obviously still intact. Here's another view of it. It's what I was looking for. You can see that skull cap is very, very well featured. You can see the color of his hair. You can see his beard that's still there. You can see he was a redhead. That's kind of intriguing. And you can see, of course, this. Now, you might think, well, that's part of his clothes, but as showing you here, that was not part of his clothes. You can see that most likely it looks like this gentleman was hung. And one of the speculations was, well, if he was hung, so executed, when he was dead, cut the noose, he fell into the bog and sank to the bog. And here we are, thousands of years later. So we're talking 4,000 years later, approximately. Here we are with this gentleman, very well preserved. But bear in mind what I said. It's a very acidic environment. And one thing we're finding is that the bones don't preserve well. So the skin does, and the internal organs do too. They're well preserved, but not the bones. They tend to break down. So it's intriguing then to see how this environment structures itself. All right, so beyond the mosses, we have ferns. Ferns are your seedless vasculars. So now we moved into the vascular plants. These have xylem and phloem then. Ferns, again, have been around for a long, long time. You can see they go back quite a ways. And their diversification, I've noted to you here, is the Devonian and the Carboniferous. I mean, they pretty much were a major part of the forest, and some have even said the forest at the time. You know, mosses were still around then, yes, but now we're having this major group come along as well. And because they had that vascular tissue, they could indeed grow very tall. It's kind of hard to think of a fern being 6 feet tall today, but back in the day, some lycophyte might have been quite a tall organism out there. So again, some changing is happening there. And you can see they do date back quite a ways. And with that, the most important thing here is that xylem and phloem pretty much, where now they have the xylem and phloem, so they have the vascular tissue, the xylem again, the root system, bringing in the water and the minerals, phloems, distributing out these like sugars and amino acids to the rest of the plant. So that's important to them. Notice we've also had a switch here. Unlike the bryophytes, where the gametophyte generation was dominant and sporophyte generation was dependent on the gametophyte generation, this is exactly opposite. Here, the sporophyte generation is the dominant, and the gametophyte generation is dependent on the sporophyte generation. So in this case, the gametophyte is this like heart-shaped structure called a prothallus. The prothallus is incredibly small. It's pretty much microscopic. You really need a microscope to see it. And it's either going to be found like right at the surface of the soil or just beneath the surface of the soil. So when you see a fern then, you're seeing sporophyte generation. You're not seeing gametophyte generation anymore. And as I noted to you, these guys are going to use spores. No seeds yet. That comes later. Okay, so like I said, these are having the sporophytes being dominant. The gametophyte is very small, and again, either at the surface or just below the soil itself. So here's the idea. This is like one of the blades on it, and they have these sporangiums. They're called a sorus. Sorus is singular. So think of like being out in the woods or the forest area, even by a home, for example. I got it at my home. And the fern is sporing, and you turn the leaves over, and you see like brown dots running the leaf. Each individual brown dot is a sorus. Multiple sorus is called sori, and that's where the sporangium are. So the spores are there. When it's proper, the spores break open, they release the spores, and it grows into the gametophyte generation. This is that roughly heart-shaped structure I was referring to, and that's called the prothallus. The prothallus, though, has both the male and female parts. You can see up here near the top, this is going to be eggs, that's archegonium, and back here by like these rhizoids, that's going to be antheridium, so that's male. Now these guys can be just released out, they blow, they find an opening, they go down, they fertilize the egg, and the gametophyte generation is now going to allow the zygote to develop into the sporophyte. That's a new sporophyte. This thing starts out like a little coiled structure. It's called a fiddlehead. There you go. Some people refer to it as a fiddle neck. It's a young, immature sporophyte, and then it's going to unfold over time into the mature sporophyte, and then you can see those brown dots running. Those are the sori that run this structure. Now, unlike the bryophytes, these guys don't self-fertilize. I don't know of it even being sometimes they self-fertilize. So where you might get that in the bryophytes here, no, they typically fertilize somewhere else. They don't self-fertilize. But a pretty direct life cycle again. In regards to what they look like, so here is a typical frond system on a fern. You can see all those brown dots running the underside of the leaflets. Those are the sori. Looking a little bit closer, you can see here is obviously a sorus. So this is the sporangium. Obviously, multiple are called sporangia that run through. As I was noting to you, see here they call it the fiddle neck. It's like an edible part, but fiddle neck, most people call them fiddle heads. This is the immature one. It's kind of coiled up. Over time, that's going to uncoil and give the frond. And then, of course, you're going to have leaflets that have the sori when it's going to be producing out. So here's a view of a beautiful little cluster of fiddle necks. You can see it's kind of coiled up there, kind of fuzzy. Some of them are fuzzy, some of them not. And this will unwind over time, open up, and so you can see here's a whole array of them. You can see they still have the tops coiled up, so they haven't finished out yet, but they're unfolding into a typical fern system. And again, you can see they're calling them fiddle necks in this case. That's fine, but typically more called the fiddle heads. So as I noted to you, they have true vascular tissue of xylem and phloems. Once again, xylem is the root system bringing up water and minerals, which will distribute up to the rest of the tree. They move through what's called a trachead system. It's like dead cell trachead system that's supported by this compound called lignin. And then the phloem system takes the sugars and amino acids and will distribute it out to the rest of the plant. There you go. The phloem system. But that's their vascular tissue. No need for hearts pumping away, nothing like that, which is pretty impressive thinking how some of these plants can get so incredibly tall. But it is giving advantage here, not only to bring in material, but also allowing for height and also to be able to be further away from water. Again, you don't have to have a fern right directly next to water. I've got tons of ferns in my backyard, for example, which I love. I think ferns are fantastic. But I don't have like a lake in my backyard. Now, granted, it rains, that kind of idea, sure, but it's not trapped at water as you would find, say, a moss maybe being. So there are your roots. I notice, of course, roots have function to it. It's not just bringing in water and minerals. Binding out the soils and sediments are very important here. So here's soils. That's very important. The root system kind of like traps the soil around them and helps to hold it down, kind of bind it down. And that's very important for keeping things in place, in particular what's called the O and A horizon of your soil profile. And that's really together as your topsoiling system, which is very important for plant growth and be able to raise crops and that kind of idea. And then it said that their main function is to absorb material, nutrients, and water. And you can see what they developed out of. Foliar leaves. Leaves are also thought to be organs. It's kind of intriguing. I mean, we're talking about embryos, so why not organs? And here, it's used to capture photonic information, so solar radiation, and therefore to drive photosynthesis and the production of sugar, so fixing your carbon to make sugar compounds. And they're noted to you the two kind of leaf types that are made, and you can see this. Pick up a leaf and look at it. If you see like one central main vein running through it, that's this guy, a microphyll. And if you see like a branching system of veins through the leaf, that's megaphylls. That's found there as well. With the microphylls, again, it's just stem system. You can kind of see that here. You had a stem, and it kind of grew a leafing system out. With the megaphylls, you had like multiple stems, and then webbing developed between them. So you go like multiple stems, and then webbing develops between them. Kind of how these things grow. But again, just prove it to yourself. Pick up a leaf and hold it up and take a look at it and kind of see it's just one central vein or this network that runs through it. As I've already mentioned before, most of this we've already talked about. There's the sporophylls run through. They have a sporangium. Remember, sporangia is plural. Sporangium is singular. So what produces the spores? Sori are the actual spore sacs itself. Notice the clusters of these guys. So sori, again, is plural. Sora is singular. And you can have multiple sporophylls together. That's called a strobillus. Multiple strobili that are run through it. For the spores themselves, you can have plants where a spore gives rise to both the male and female parts. If that's the case, it is called homosporous. And then you have some plants where it's individual. That spore gives rise to the male part. That spore gives rise to the female part. In that case, it's called heterosporous. And notice here the megaspores, that's female gametophyte. Microspores, that's male gametophyte. This is a graphic showing the exact same thing. Homosporous, single spore type. You're going to get male and female out of that single spore type. Heterosporous, it's separate. Megasporangium, megaspore gives rise to female parts. Microsporangium, microspore gives rise to male parts. It's again very direct. Last but not least, pretty much for this chapter, it's looking at some of the major groups that's out there. So this is still talking about the seedless vascular. Bear in mind one last time, we will not talk about the seeded vascular until the next chapter, gymnosperms and angiosperms. So here are the main groups. Phylum Lycophyta, so lycophytes, and I mentioned them earlier, that might be the big trees in the forest kind of idea. And you can see it, the other mosses, club mosses, spike mosses, and of course your quillworts. And then Pterophyta, and Pterophyta I think of ferns in that case. Horsetail and whisk ferns are also there also. So with the lycophytes, again, some of these guys are huge. Just big structures. So again, this could have been a big old forest back in the day. Not so much ferns. I mean, ferns can get kind of large, but I think big here. Notice you can see these things in swamps, and they've been around a long, long time, as we noted earlier too. And then you have the club mosses and spike mosses. They're vascular tissues, and as I said, don't confuse them with mosses. This is the phylum Bryophyta. So be careful. Again, not bryophytes, that's everybody. This is just a phylum Bryophyta. These guys are everybody else. So here's just a picture of them. Again, don't worry so much about pictures on this exam. I'm more after the idea behind everything, application questions. That's what I want on the lecture exam. This is more lab stuff, but just to give you an idea. Spike moss, it doesn't look really spiky, but we call it quillwort. You can definitely see why it's called a quillwort. That's pretty impressive. And this club moss, you can see those clusters of the sporophylls. So it's strobili in this case, that run through it. Kind of a nice idea of what those things look like. For ferns, doing pretty well. I mean, 12,000 species. Still not really holding a huge candle to animals. I mean, we've been very successful, but that doesn't undermine in any way, shape, or form how important these guys are. Like I said, they go right from the tropics. I think I said subtropics, but no big deal. Tropics all the way up to the temperate zone. So these guys do quite well also. They're found in a lot of places. Horsetails from the Carboniferous. You can see where the genus is. Quisetum. That's a good name for it. This should kind of ring a bell. An animal what looks like this. So it's called horsetail because it kind of looks like, say like a parade horse or one that's in a show, how they kind of club the tail a little bit. It's got like that elongated appearance to it. It's kind of bald at the end. It's kind of what these guys look like, hence how they got the name. And then whisk ferns, if you cook, think of like a whisk that you use in cooking. These look kind of like that in a way, so hence how they got their name. There you go, Felix femina, beautiful. The lady ferns here in Florida, we have both the lady fern and the southern lady fern. They're here, so kind of the same idea. But we have the Felix femina here, and you can see it's a beautiful fern type. What people typically think of ferns. This one, notice why they call it the horsetail. In this case, the equisetum, you can see why. It's got that clubbed appearance you might see like on a parade horse or a show horse. And then the whisk fern, again, think about cooking, you have a whisk. This is kind of reminding people of that. So sort of how these things got their names. And finally, like I was noting to you, please don't ever forget the very, very important environmental role of plants in general. So not just here, non-vascular, non-seeded, vascular, seedless, and then the vascular seeded. They're all important to what they do in the environment. And we should, if on that ground alone, if I may, I know this is kind of soapbox-like, but on that ground alone, be thinking of them and note that they're really necessary to protect. But along that idea, this is giving you a direct indication of what some of these seedless vascular plants have done. Notice one of the roles here that they strip out this carbon material that's in the atmosphere, so CO2. And they've done it to such a degree in some points that has actually caused these little global cooling periods. Today, with this whole issue of global warming, and I'll leave it to you to discern that issue and whether you believe it or not, this really isn't the forum for that. A very important subject, mind you, and one that we should discuss, but this is not the forum to do so, not at this moment. But still, when plants are out there, I noted earlier, they can strip out CO2 from the environment, and that's critically important. So if somebody does believe in global warming, and again, scientists typically do, but if we do believe in that, and we're talking about, wow, CO2 is running away, NASA, for example, has noted that in the next century, we might have between 500 and 800 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. That is unheard of. You're talking about environmental issues. We're already there, mind you, perhaps, but that's going to be just that much worse. It's going to be scary, to say the least. Well, on top of that, now we're maybe talking about losing plants. Now we're talking about a major sink of CO2. This could be very critical. This has been very important to us, the role of plants in the environment, including something like these seedless vasculars, so your pterophytes and your lycophytes. Very, very important in these guys, including coal. But bear in mind, that's kind of a catch-22, where you're talking about, well, it's coal. We use coal for energy sources, at least we can. It's one of several energy types out there, of course. And therefore, that's not very green. You're burning that stuff. And yes, there's the idea of clean coal. Okay, fine. But one, I would ask you, go find out exactly how clean that is, what we have to do technology-wise to try and talk about that. But it's an energy source. But it came out of these guys. So not only do we need them around in regards to cleaning up the atmosphere, helping to clean up the CO2 footprint that we leave behind, but sort of this cyclic issue about, well, we're dumping out CO2 and where did that come from? It's kind of an intriguing discussion all the way around. But just to note the fact that these plant types are, like other plants, very important to you and I on several grounds, not just energy issue, but also role in the environment. And we should remember that. Be sure then to think about the need to protect them. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. As always, as I've said on other videos, please make sure then that you read your chapters as normal, that you also look over the full PowerPoint that I have online for you, which is virtually the same thing as this, but just make sure you pick up on the little tidbits. And then as always, please feel free to come by and ask any questions you have. Thank you very much.